Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Happy Monday. Thank you so much for joining us today for Monday Mornings at Maine. My name's Heather Miller. I'm one of your adult programming librarians here at the La Crosse Public Library. If you have any questions or need any accommodations, I'll be in the back of the room. Please come see me. Today, it is my pleasure to present Scott Lind, who is a licensed professional electrical engineer and master electrician who has worked for 35 years on a wide variety of power and lighting designs. Today, he'll be speaking about the Kickapoo Valley Dark Sky Initiative, which is a conservation initiative focused on providing education and resources for individuals, businesses, and communities to prevent light pollution and protect dark skies in the Kickapoo Valley and beyond. Please give him a warm welcome.
I appreciate your time here today, and Heather for the invitation. Uh, really, if you think about it, the problem of lighting at night is increasing very, very rapidly. It's been a problem for many years, but because of the introduction of LED lights, the problem's accelerated. And one way to think about that is that if a child was born today, and you just say they could see 250 stars in the sky, by the time they turn 18, at the rate things are changing right now, they'll only be able to see 100 stars. That's how quickly, in 18 years, that's how much the sky is degrading because of the increase of light pollution at night. And so that's really the impetus for this Kickapoo Valley Dark Sky Initiative. If you're familiar with Wildcat Mountain State Park, or the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, or the Mississippi Valley Conservancy, their Tunnelville Cliffs property, which is south of Lafarge, about 3 years ago, we intended to create an international dark sky park on those three properties, about 13,000 acres. We put that application in. We made a lot of lighting changes at the park and at the reserve. Simultaneously, we started taking sky measurements because you obviously have to be dark enough to qualify to be a dark sky park. And in 2021, we were dark enough, and I'll show you a lot of detail here in just a minute, but by 2023, we were no longer dark enough. The sky had gotten bright enough over that 30-month period, 2.5 years, that we no longer qualified. So we had two choices. One is just to say, well, we didn't get it, right? The other choice was to kind of dig in and figure out how we can get it back. And so that's what I'm here to talk about today. And I'm talking in lots and lots of places to a lot of people about this topic. And we do have an opportunity to make it dark again, but it's going to take a big effort. So that's what we're here to talk about today. See if we can get her. There we go. This is a quote from the former village president of Ontario, where I happen to live. And he really says it better than anybody else could say it, I think, right? We don't need as much light as we have right now. We just need to put it where it belongs instead of putting it up into the sky. That's really what it boils down to. So this is a little video that's going to run. I'll let it run. If you can see La Crosse in the upper left-hand corner, hopefully you can read those words. Viroqua kind of in the middle left, Richland Center down at the bottom right, Tomah and Fort McCoy at the top. The area in the center, where it's blue, represents where the dark sky park was going to go, essentially. That's from Ontario down to Lafarge. That's where those properties I mentioned are located. And blue is the minimum level to qualify. As soon as you get any other color on that map except blue, you're too bright. Okay, so La Crosse is red. If you have Milwaukee on here, Milwaukee would be white because it's so bright in Milwaukee. But in the areas that are blue, that would be dark enough to qualify for a dark sky park. What you can see is that from 2016 to 2020, there was some change, but not much change. And then from 2020 to 2022, there's a dramatic difference. So that's why we didn't qualify any longer. So this is a lot of data. I don't expect you to read this chart, but what I'm going to tell you about this is we've been taking ground measurements for all those years. And if you can see those numbers, the ground measured change from 2021 to 23 at the north end of that property at Wildcat Mountain State Park, if you know where Wildcat is, right there by Ontario, the sky got 54% brighter. And at the south end of that property, down at Tunnelville Cliffs area, about 12 miles away, it got 67% brighter. And we now know why that is, but at the time we took these measurements, it was quite baffling because we'd made some changes to lighting in the area, including in Ontario, thinking it would improve things. And so seeing these huge increases really made us think, well, these measurements are probably wrong, right? They can't be correct. But in fact, they are correct. And after taking those measurements, we came across this study from Washington State that talks about exactly the phenomenon that we identified in Ontario, where they changed all the high-pressure sodium street lights, which have been around since the 60s, which are orange, to LEDs. And we're going to talk a lot about color temperature and some of the details. But the gist of this is that those orange high-pressure sodium lights do not scatter in the atmosphere in the same way that LED lights do. Even if the light is directed upward, because of the color that it is, it doesn't scatter in the same way that LED light typically does. And so what they found was, when they made measurements before and afterwards, that the sky glow increased in 60% in an adjacent national park. The same exact percentage, just by coincidence or by whatever. But we had made similar changes to Ontario, replacing high-pressure sodium lights with 3,000 Kelvin LEDs, and got the same numbers. So it really told the story in a way that explained why we got the numbers we got. The other thing that's important to know is if any of you are familiar, and you probably aren't, but if any of you go looking on the internet for satellite images of sky glow, of sky brightness, like the one I showed you that video of, you can get those online for free. They're available. In fact, there's a fellow in Madison at the UW who does those maps. That's where that map came from. The important thing to know is that even though that looks bad, that is a very small fraction of the actual increase. And we're going to explain why that's true. So if you look at the image on the upper right and at the bottom right, that's essentially the change in the upper right shows almost no change over that transition. And at the bottom shows you what the actual change was, measured from the ground. So the satellites are missing a huge amount of light pollution because of the types of lights we're putting in. So here's the results of that study. Got 60% brighter. The VIIRS satellite failed to detect that increase. So the satellite data did not show that increase. It didn't register with the satellites. And the takeaway is that if you are to do a one-for-one replacement of street lights, or any other light for that matter, that's high pressure sodium, and put in a standard LED, typical LED, the sky is going to get brighter. So that's the key takeaway from that. So the question is, why should you even care about this, right? Well, there are lots of reasons why you might want to care. It has major wildlife impacts, has impacts on human health. It wastes energy, which obviously impacts climate change. You're better off, actually, with dark sky lighting in terms of crime and safety, which might seem counterintuitive, and we'll explain that in a few minutes. And then the last thing is just the fact that we're losing our night sky. So for generation after generation after generation, people could see the Milky Way, people could see the stars, and it's just since the advent of electric lighting and getting rapidly worse that we can no longer see, what's in the sky above us. So for me personally, one of the most important things is the fact that this has such a negative impact on other species. And there's a book by Ed Yong called An Immense World. And I think maybe the library might have it here, Heather. And it's a wonderful book. It talks about the impacts on all species of humanity, essentially, and how they perceive the world differently than us. And the last chapter, chapter 13, talks specifically about light at night and about sound. And there's a quote in this book from Travis Longcore, and that's part of it up there on the screen. Let me see if I can give you the full quote. So we too quickly forget we don't perceive the world in the same way as other species, and consequently we ignore the impacts that we shouldn't. We normalize the abnormal and accept the unacceptable. Remember that more than 80% of people live under light-polluted skies. Many people have no idea what true darkness or quiet feels like. Within that experience, vicious cycles start to spin. As we desecrate the sensory environment, we become accustomed to the results. As we push animals away, we get used to their absence. As the problem of sensory pollution grows, our willingness to address it subsides. How do we solve a problem that we don't realize exists? And I think that's a key thing when I talk to people, is that because this has been a relatively slow progression, and because as humans, our sensitivity to changes in light levels are surprisingly poor. We don't recognize large changes in light levels like you think you might. Other species aren't the same way. And so we don't even realize this is a problem many days, many nights. We don't even recognize it as a problem, but it is a huge problem. So this is from Design Lights Consortium, which is a nonprofit that tests light fixtures nationwide, mainly to qualify them for energy rebates. They got a new program called Luna, Luna, that they're hoping will have an impact, a positive impact on light pollution, keeping all the energy efficiency attributes that they test for, right? So these fixtures would qualify for energy rebates, but still have less impact on night sky and on other species. But they've compiled some of these problems. The research on this, the impacts to other species, just continues to pile up. It's amazing the number of studies that have been done and are continuing to be done that just continue to reinforce the impacts on many, many species. This is a human health issue. The AMA back in 2016 published a white paper talking about the impact, in particular of LED fixtures, because of the blue spectrum in LEDs. And we're going to talk about what that means, have blue spectrum in a light fixture. This is a study that just came out in March out of the UK. And the results are pretty staggering, honestly, but they put light monitors on 88,000 people and then looked at their health effects many years later, okay, how it affected their health many, many years later. And those are the results. They were just published in March, just widely distributed just in the last month and a half, I became aware of them. But huge impacts on, and the interesting part about this is they measured both their light during the day, inside a building in particular. They measured where they were, but when we're inside buildings like we are right now, we aren't exposed to sunlight as if we were outside working. That also has a huge negative impact on our health. So the impact of night light was greater than the impact of not having enough light during the day, but the same is actually true during the day. If you're not exposed to enough bright light of the right spectrum during the day, it also has large predictability about your lifespan, which we might not think about, but that's the way it is. So when we weren't inside buildings all the time, we're outside working all the time. That was what our bodies apparently have become accustomed to over eons. And just in the last, say 100 years, when we're inside under electric light, that's not good for us during the day. We want to be exposed to brighter lights during the day and darker at night. And so it's important in both ways. From my perspective, the most important thing, of course, is at night, but it's really true during the day and night. And you want opposite things. Energy use, just the wasted outdoor light, because of fixtures that aren't shielded, fixtures that are too bright, waste about $7 billion worth of energy every year, okay? And lots of carbon dioxide released. And if you think about light at night, even though we're transitioning to solar and wind and other things, at night, solar is not helping us, right? We aren't storing much energy right now, still, right? Eventually we'll maybe store some energy. Right now we aren't storing much energy. So whatever we're using to put power lights at night is probably not solar, and it probably isn't even wind. It's probably still coal-fired power plants or power plants that aren't using those other technologies. So what are the causes for all this? And it's really the fact that so many new fixtures and replacements of existing fixtures are what I call glare bombs, and I'll have some images for you, which means they're not shielded. For example, that fixture right there in that out the window, even though it's yellow, which is good, is not shielded. That light goes all kinds of different directions. In the case of LEDs, most of them are too blue, and I'll talk about what that means. They're, in most cases, far too bright. They're much brighter than they need to be, and they're on when they're not needed, right? So that's really the root cause of all these things. So let's talk about the path, how we get to better lighting. The left example is a fixture that's not shielded. It's throwing light all directions. You add some shielding, you can direct it downward. You put in a warmer color temperature lamp, so it doesn't scatter as much. You reduce the intensity to only what's needed, so you have less light to scatter to begin with. And then you control it, so it's only on when you need it to be on. Those are really the key things. So just 3 definitions. When I talk about fully shielded, or also called full cutoff fixtures, that means that in that light fixture, there is no light above 90 degrees. It goes up, nothing up here. And counterintuitive, maybe, is the fact that that means that the lens has to be flat. So even if the light bulb is up here, if I have a lens that's down here, that can create uplight because of reflections in there. So you really want the lens to be fully recessed like this. There's another version of it. like this. This is the wall-mounted fixture. And again, you can see the lenses down here. You don't see the lens unless you're looking up into it. So that's what that means when I say full cutoff or fully shielded. A lumen is just a measure of how bright a light is. That's all it is. And then color temperature is a way to describe the color of light. You know, is it warm? Is it bright? Is it warm? Is it cooler? And we'll talk about how you define that in terms of color temperature, what the units are for that, which is Kelvin, degrees Kelvin, which are now on light bulb boxes. If you go to the store and look at light bulbs, there'll be a K number on there, 4-digit number, usually ranging from 2,200 up to 5,000. That's really the range. And then it'll have a K behind it. And that's the color temperature of the light. And that's a key thing to understand. So here's just, I use this as the poster child for what not to do. It's a Dollar General store in Wilton. And those lights are obviously too bright. You wouldn't know, but they're very, very blue. They're 5,000 Kelvin, which is at the high end of the spectrum for LEDs. So they put out a lot of blue light, which scatters a lot, but you can see the scatter there. And they're not full cutoff fixtures. Right? Correct. Yep. It creates a lot of scatter in the atmosphere, which creates a glow that you can't see through, right? You can't see through that glow. Like when you're in the fog at night and your headlights hit the fog, the same idea. So this is what it looks like looking from that building across the street. So there's no flash. I just took that picture. There's no flash there at all. So you can imagine those neighbors, right? That's what they see at night, right? So does that look like it makes sense? I mean, in this case, you know, the street is like, you know, way above the parking lot and all that green space and the houses across the street. And yet we're lighting all of that with these lights on the building. There's no reason for that. The lights are intended to light the parking lot. So it should stop right at the edge of the parking bumpers, right? So why does this happen? So, you know, one of the common beliefs is that more light is better. And certainly if you want to see at night, you need some light. We all need some light to be able to see at night. Our eyes, we don't see in complete darkness. But at some point, that changes, right? You need a certain amount of light, and after that, it gets worse. It makes actually seeing worse for you because of contrast. The other reason is that LEDs are much more efficient, and so all that extra light is cheap. It doesn't cost you much to have too much light, and so you're not really incentivized to make it the right amount. You're incentivized just to put in whatever you can afford. In the case of LEDs, you can afford a lot of light compared to what you used to be able to afford. The cheapest fixtures in terms of purchase costs, especially early on, tended to be these very blue fixtures, 4,000 Kelvin, 5,000 Kelvin. We'll talk about that in detail. And also the fact that the things I'm sharing with you, the studies that have been done on human health, studies have been done on, you know, other species, that isn't widely known. So we're kind of naive about the impacts of these things at this point. But that's starting to change. And so I just told Heather this morning, I'm more optimistic than I've ever been before that we actually are going to turn things around and make the sky darker again. Because we're right at the intersection right now of more understanding of the problem and the fact that manufacturers are producing more fixtures at warmer color temperatures, which have less scatter, have less glare, and those are becoming more available. So we're right at the intersection of those things right now. And so I'm more optimistic than I've ever been that we're actually going to turn this around, but it takes knowledge and it takes a willingness to do it. So there's 5 principles we're going to talk about. The first one is useful, and that's pretty simple. It's the easiest one is like, do you even need a light at all? Is there a reason for this light fixture? That's the first thing to think. And there's lots of reasons why you want light, but just think about whether you need it at all. That's the first thing. It's all it is. The second one is targeted, putting the light where it belongs. And there's a graphic that shows that. So this is representing a street light. So the idea here is that the useful light and the targeted light should be on the street and maybe a sidewalk that's adjacent to the street. But lawns next to the street, the fronts of buildings, the sky, all of that is wasted light. That's not where the light's supposed to go, right? The other important thing to know about that is, you know, the impact of that wasted light on your vision when you're not inside the area that's the targeted area in terms of glare. And so there's always going to be some glare. If you're driving down the street at night and there's street lights there, those street lights are intended to light the street. And it's virtually impossible to eliminate all glare when you're driving down the street at night. There are fixtures that do a better job. And if you happen to go through Westby, by the way, Westby just installed brand new streetlights. And keep your eyes on the road, but notice when you go through Westby at night that you almost don't see the light bulbs in those new lights until you're right underneath them. When you're driving to Westby, especially from the north, but even from the south, especially from the north, you see pools of light underneath these fixtures, but you don't see any glare off those fixtures. It's really fantastic. Those fixtures are some of the best I've ever seen for low glare. They provide great light where it belongs. And that's the whole idea, is to provide light where it belongs, get rid of the glare, get rid of the light spill. So when I talk about full cutoff, kind of like these fixtures here, that's what I mean, is that the lens is keeping that light from going up. And here's an example of the most typical fixtures we see, right? You see a lot of these get installed today. If you drive on Highway 33 on the way to Westby through St. Joseph, if any of you have an account at the St. Joseph Bank or know somebody there, talk to me afterwards, because I'd like to talk to them about their lighting on their building there. It was put in maybe a year ago. My wife and I dance at the Concordia Ballroom a lot, so we drive through there a lot at night. And it's one of the worst installations. I think it's actually worse than that Dollar General that I showed you, if that's believable, but I think it is. But those fixtures look just like that. And they're way too bright, and they're throwing light across the street onto the neighbors' houses. And apparently they accept them because it's been that way for many, many months now, and they're still operating. So the amount needed, how much light do you need? And that differs by the application, obviously, right? If you're talking about your back door at your house, where you've got some steps, or if you're talking about the place where people might get dropped off in front of Gunderson for a health appointment, those are very different needs for lighting, how much you need. And so it's important to know how much you need, and don't put any more than you need, because then you're wasting energy and causing excess sky glow. So this is what I talked about earlier about the myth that more light, it makes you safer. So if you look at these two photographs, the lower one, you can probably see that guy standing at the gate. He's also standing at the gate above. But you can't see him. The camera couldn't see him, because cameras operate the same way as our eyes do. When there's too much contrast, that closes down and it can't pick up things that are dark. So when you have huge contrast, it makes your vision worse and you're less safe, right? You can't see things that are actually there because of that huge amount of contrast. So the idea is to provide uniformity, right? And by providing uniformity, you can also lower the overall light level. The more uniform it is. You need less uniform light to be able to see well than you do when you've got these super bright lights and then dark areas. So the 4000 is actually the color temperature of the light, not the amount of light. So in this case, it's really, this could be any color of light, could be any color temperature of light, could be 2200 Kelvin up to 4000, 5000 Kelvin. This is trying to show the principle that if you have too much light in terms of lumens, how bright it is, regardless of color temperature, that you lose that visibility because of that contrast. So there are two different concepts, but both are important. And the color temperature one has to do with how much light scatters in the atmosphere. And the lumen number is how bright it is and how your eye reacts to it.
That's also lumen, it's for the glare?
Lumen is also for glare, yes, correct. Yep. And the last principle, the fourth principle is really about color temperature, that K number, right? And if you listen to a presentation I gave back in February, I would have told you that 3000 Kelvin and below was what you should go for. Because of our experience in Ontario, where the sky got 50% brighter right outside of Ontario. And by the way, the reason it got so much brighter down south, I didn't explain that to you, is because in Lafarge at the south end, they changed streetlights out to 4000 Kelvin LEDs, bluer LEDs. They get more scatter and the sky got brighter. So we could see that impact over that 12-mile area just in that difference in fixture choice. And so now that we know that, what I'm really advocating for is to go to the warmest color temperature you can live with, right? High pressure sodium lights we lived with for 60 years are 2100 Kelvin. So if we could live with that for 60 years and put LEDs in at the same color temperature, which are now available, and only fairly recently available, but more and more manufacturers are producing them, right? Then we can actually make the sky darker. But as soon as we go above 2200 Kelvin, any LED we put in is going to make the sky brighter, period. So unless you shut it off, or really reduce the lumens. But if you want to maintain the light level on the ground, the same light level you had before, and you use anything bluer than 2200 Kelvin, the sky is going to get brighter. And the bluer you go, the higher number you go, the more scatter you get. And it's not a linear relationship, it's an exponential relationship. So pick the warmest number, the lowest number you can find and live with, and to reduce the impact on the sky. So now I'm telling people, don't go above 2700, but ideally go to 2200. So for me, the biggest opportunity we have in the short term is for all the places that have high pressure sodium lights that are still installed. And there are many in the areas I live in. If I drive through Cashton, there are lots and lots of high pressure sodium lights, and you can identify them yourself by driving through places at night, and you'll see the orange or yellow lights. Those are high pressure sodium, almost certainly, even though there are LEDs available now at that color, but what you're gonna see is gonna be 99% high pressure sodium. If we changed all those high pressure sodium lights to a 2200 Kelvin LED, we get the same amount of light on the ground, better quality of light, and we'll talk about that in a minute, better quality of light in terms of how it renders color. We could actually make the sky darker. And so in the short term, that's really where I'm trying to focus, is to get as many installations changed to a 2200 Kelvin LED so people can see them and decide if they can accept them or not, as opposed to changing those out to a much bluer LED that's going to create all kinds of sky glow. So finally, here's color temperature. A candle is about 1000 degrees Kelvin. Incandescent lamps we say anywhere from 3000 to 3200. I think I've actually seen them described as low as 2700 Kelvin for an incandescent lamp. Basically equivalent to a sunset. Daylight is anywhere from, a daylight, not a daylight lamp, but actual daylight, 5500 and up in terms of color temperature, very, very blue. And so the tendency when LEDs first came out and were starting to be used for general purpose lighting was because it was more energy efficient to make them at these blue color temperatures. That's what got made. It was easier to do. And so that's why so many of the LEDs that were sold at the beginning and still are sold today are very, very blue in color temperature. And we've become used to that as a society, that when you change from a high pressure sodium light to an LED, it's going to be white. And we somehow think that's better because that looks closer to daylight. But our bodies don't want that color light at night. They really don't. They want a warmer light, not that really, really blue light. But that's what color temperature is. That's in correlated color temperature measured in degrees Kelvin. That's one of the numbers you'll see in that box, is that K number. So keep it as low as you can find. And this explains the sky glow. Again, it's a table. I apologize for the busyness of it, but essentially what it's showing you is that high pressure sodium lights in the first line right there are considered the baseline for sky glow. They're considered 1.0. As soon as you go to a 2200 Kelvin LED, that's 60% higher than a high pressure sodium lamp. But I just told you that if we installed 2200 Kelvin LEDs, we could make the sky darker. How is that possible? And that's because LED fixtures, compared to those high pressure sodium fixtures, are built differently. So there really aren't, I shouldn't say aren't any, but there aren't many high pressure sodium fixtures that are full cutoff. Most of them have a lens that hangs down. As a result, they scatter light to the sky. And so utility companies like Alliant Energy, when they change out street lights from high pressure sodium to LEDs, they cut the lumens in half. The total amount of light that's coming out of that fixture is cut in half. And they get the same amount of light on the ground because all the light is going down. Yes? Yeah, can't give you an exact number, but it's vastly less energy to use LEDs, right? So it's much more energy efficient to use LEDs. There's no question we're going to use LEDs. I specify LEDs every single day. I wouldn't specify anything else other than LEDs. And that's why we can save energy and improve the light level with LEDs. The key is to pick the right color temperature and to pick the right amount of light. Don't just put extra light in. So as you increase in color temperature, that sky glow impact just keeps on going up, right? But the reason you can put 2200K LEDs in is because you can reduce the amount of lumens coming out of the fixture, because half of them are going to the sky or somewhere else other than where they're supposed to go. With LEDs, you can direct all that light where you want it, and so you can use less of it. And so therefore, that percentage gets cut in half essentially. So you go from 1.0, say 0.75. So you can actually make the sky darker by going to those LEDs, but you have to stay at those low color temperatures. So just a graphic showing you that same thing instead of the table. As soon as you go to bluer and bluer LEDs, the sky glow impact increases, right? And it's dramatically different. So that's why it's important to stay at the far left. And the final principle is control things. You know, use timers, use motion sensors, use dimmers to do these things. Again, that technology also continues to improve and become more available, which again is why I'm more optimistic than ever that we're going to have a chance to turn this around. And in fact, the code in Wisconsin, I've got a slide for it here, for commercial buildings since 2018 has required lighting to be shut off at night at commercial buildings. Now, if you know, not existing buildings, but new buildings that are constructed since 2018, at night, those lights should be off. How many buildings do you know have been built since 2018 where the lights go off at night? Most don't, right? If you drive around at night after midnight, there's a lot of lights on in commercial buildings at night, on the outside of the building, parking lot lighting, building mounted lighting, because this is almost entirely not enforced. Even in places you might suspect it would be enforced, like Madison, it's not enforced. And so one of the things that I'm trying to make happen is to get that enforced. If we actually enforce that rule, this problem would get dramatically better, right? We could really improve things just by simply enforcing that existing rule. And we use an old version of the energy code. That version of the energy code was written in 2015, I believe. Every 3 years, there's a new version of that energy code. It's called the International Energy Code. It's adopted nationwide, and different jurisdictions adopt different versions, right? Wisconsin is very, very far out of date. The newer versions that are adopted in many other states actually require motion sensing on parking lot lights. And so even when the building's in operation, if you have a part of your parking lot that isn't used, just sitting there empty, nobody's in it, those lights will shut off per the code by law, right? We don't require that in Wisconsin yet. We don't even enforce this yet. But that's a huge opportunity in something that already exists as law. If we simply enforced it, we'd have a big impact. So the benefits of this are really, you don't waste any energy. If you follow all 5 principles, the only energy you're using is the energy you need. The light's going where you need it to go, it's the right amount of light, et cetera. It's on when you need it, not otherwise not. You really do get better property security and safety, and you get much less light trespass. And to that second point, Asofia Park in Vernon County is a very rural park, if you've ever been there. There's a bathroom building there. LED lights were put in there, I think 5 years ago, on the outside of that bathroom building, 5 LED lights. I didn't bring a sample along, but they're unshielded. People had taken it upon themselves, because you can camp right next to this bathroom building. People had taken it upon themselves to bring their duct tape along and tape over those fixtures because they were so bright, right? And they were on all night. What's that? If it works, right? And they were LEDs, so they were much more efficient than other light sources, but they were 4,000 Kelvin, so they were very blue, so a lot of glare, a lot of scatter, and obviously unshielded. And so the Friends of Vernon County Parks decided to retrofit those lights, and I picked a slightly different fixture than this, but similar to this fixture right here. Looks very similar to this, so it sat on the building wall like this now. Instead of having a lens here that was shining light everywhere, it only goes down. We cut the amount of watts in half. Even going from an LED to an LED, we cut the amount of watts in half. The light on the ground around the bathroom building went up 50%. We got more light on the ground by the bathroom building. In fact, I wanted to add a dimmer to it, but it wasn't set up for dimming, so I couldn't add a dimmer to it, because we didn't need more light on the ground. We had plenty, but I can't dim that fixture because of the way it's installed right now. So you can see that, even when you go from LED to LED, there's huge opportunities to go from an unshielded fixture to a shielded fixture. And now when you go to that park and look, and we also made them warmer. We put in 3,000 K. I would go lower today. In fact, there are fixtures coming out in December. And so for Sidey Hollow Park in Vernon County, we're going to do a 2,200 K fixture on that building, on that bathroom building. And that's what we'll use in the future at places like that. I'm going to do the same thing in Lafarge at the park there, and that building will be 2,200 K as soon as that fixture becomes available. But if you ever, I see a lot of nodding heads, you've been to those parks. If you remember what those were like before, you can see that you get the same amount of security, right? There's no difference. You get great light where you need it, but you haven't got the glare in your eyes, and you aren't throwing light all over the place. And then the benefits to human health and to other species like we talked about. So really just remember those key things, right? Use a maximum color temperature of 2700 Kelvin, preferably 2200 Kelvin or lower. Use lower lumens. Make sure it's fully shielded. That's the key thing, is make sure that fixture is fully shielded, and then control it so it's useful. So it's only on when you need it to be on. If you do all those things, I mean, we can really have an impact on this problem. So thank you. What light is the mayfly? I'm not a biologist. I don't know that particular question. Right. What's interesting about that question is there was a study that was just published, I would say in the last month, done out of Germany, because I think we're all aware that moths have been attracted to light. And there was a study published in the spring, just a few months ago, that talked about why those moths hang around that light fixture. And it's not because of the fact they're attracted to the heat or attracted to the light. It's because of the fact they're trying to orient themselves to the moon, which is what they see that light as. And they're constantly trying to turn their backs to that light fixture because that's what they're supposed to do when they're normally flying at night. They use the moon as their guideline for where to go. So that study was just published last spring. The new study that was just published, they literally glued antennas onto the back of 90 moths and then tracked those moths using a special kind of radar done in Germany. And what they found was only 4% of those moths were actually attracted to the light. You're like, oh, well, that's good. That means that whole thing about lights being bad for moths is, so what, right? It's not a big deal. It's only 4%. The other 96% actively avoided the lights. So if they were going this direction and came to a light, they actively turned away from that light. So I had a discussion this morning with my wife about that, and maybe I'm the only person that sees it that way, but the way I view that is that our perception of how big that problem was is way too small. We thought the only problem was the amount of the moths that were attracted to the light. It's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. We see the iceberg, we see the tip of the iceberg, we don't see the rest of the problem, which is the fact that 96% of those moths were diverted from their normal path because of that light. So I can't answer the question about the mayflies, but I think it's a similar thing. Right. And I think in general that's true. The lower color temperature is generally speaking less of a problem for insects, but I don't want to say that emphatically, but I think that's generally true, that the lower color temperature is better. Yeah. In Arizona, I've not heard of that town. She said that Marana, Arizona has no street lights.
First time that we were there taking care of our granddaughter at the time.
Yeah.
Because we walked out the doors and we expected to, in the evening, and
Yep.
expected there to be streetlights, and we didn't know the streets, and there were no streetlights whatsoever.
Right. Well, and it's interesting you bring that up about streetlights and the impacts of streetlights. Studies that were done as far back as 2012 in several different states by different researchers found that the kind of tongue-in-cheek conclusion was we shouldn't have streetlights because when you're driving, actually having contrast is an advantage. When you see something in your head, if you have too much light on a street at night, then you don't see that contrast when you're driving. So it's kind of counterintuitive that way, but yeah. Right. The question was, how do you address street light brightness with the city where, what are the facts that help counter that argument? There are a lot of studies, but one of the issues is that the initial studies that were done, which are being relied upon by the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency and the Federal Highway Administration, and therefore by all these state agencies of Wisconsin DOT, which filters down. When those studies were done, these warm LEDs were not available. So what they compared in those studies was a high pressure sodium street light, which had no directionality. It was just a high pressure sodium light throwing light every which direction, with a LED that looked similar to this, which had really good directionality that was 4,000 Kelvin. And the conclusion was that 4,000 Kelvin was better than high pressure sodium, but it wasn't looking at an equal to equal comparison. And so as a result, those studies showed that you were better off with those 4,000 Kelvin streetlights. In terms of brightness, there are certainly federal guidelines for roads. Now, again, how rigorously those are followed is hard to say. If you're in a state highway, new state highway designs, so not retrofits, but new state highway designs have very particular fixtures that you have to choose from. They tell you what fixtures to use, and therefore you get a certain amount of light on the highway. Again, I think those those decisions are based on research that was done, quite a while ago. So getting the new research that's been done into the hands of the people that can have an influence on that is one of the things I'm working on, right? But it's not a quick process. I would say though that if you have those kind of concerns, I would certainly reach out to those people and express those concerns. And I'm trying to think if I can give you a good research paper to cite. I can't off the top of my head, but certainly there is new research that would support that position. There's an organization based out of Texas. I forget the name of that organization. I don't personally subscribe to their philosophy of like, we're going to ban all LEDs, which seems to be their philosophy, right? Because as an engineer, I recognize there's huge benefits to using LED lights. They seem to take the position that we have to get rid of all LEDs, that they're evil, right? It's impractical, I think, from my perspective to say that. But there is an organization that is heavily pressuring regulatory agencies, suing manufacturers, trying to get LED lights completely off of cars of all kinds. I think that's an impractical solution, but I think the motivation is right, because I also, when I drive at night, when I see an LED light, it is blinding, right? So.
If they've been doing that since they found out the studies from that journal to them.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Audi already has laser.
Wow. Okay. You're outside my realm of expertise there. I've not heard of the laser lights. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting idea.
How to study,
Yeah.
where they have the lights, they've already got it outside,
Laser type.
so they're using it. Oh, they're
Like
studying.
what happened to fluorescent lighting?
What happened to it?
Yeah, compact fluorescent lighting. and
Yeah.
it's
Well, it's
better
been,
than LED.
it's less energy efficient than LEDs. It doesn't last as long as LEDs. Compact fluorescent, well, all fluorescent lights really contain some mercury. Some are less than others, but they all contain some amount of mercury, which is not true of LEDs. And so there were big environmental benefits to going to LED as soon as they became available to use for general lighting. There are some places that still use fluorescent lights on new installations, but I would say in my experience, that's 1% maybe of the market would be new installations with fluorescents. So we're,
Commercial law, you voted it.
yeah,
That include housing.
does not include housing, doesn't include apartment buildings, no.
Lit up.
All lit up, right. And so I worked with an apartment complex, just got built in Ontario, and I was able to get to the developer soon enough, right? I mean, the key is timing of all this. You learn about it and then you talk to them. And so they put fully shielded lights on that building, which they were not going to before. They didn't know any of this. And they used 2,700 Kelvin on the outside of the building. And so, that was a win, but didn't cost any more. No, it didn't cost any more. So it's the key is to get to them at the right amount of time, in the right time, and to know who to talk to, right? And it was a lot of back and forth with me and the developer and the electrician to make that happen. And sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I've got a meeting tonight with a board for another apartment complex in Norwalk that's an existing building and looking at retrofitting their lights to dark sky friendly lighting. In that case, it's going to cost more, but that building is surrounded by sidewalks, which are incredibly poorly lit right now. There are areas that are completely black and areas that have these huge spots of light that are just, blinding. And so what I'm proposing to them is a much more uniform light level, which means we're going to put some short poles in around these perimeter sidewalks, which is we'll see if they approve it or not. But that really has more to do with properly lighting to begin with than what technology we're using or whether it's dark sky. And because we're using dark sky fixtures where we're controlling the light, it'd be a lot cheaper to achieve uniform lighting than it would be if we didn't use dark sky fixtures. So either way, we'll go to dark sky fixtures. It's just whether they want to put the extra money into making the light more uniform for all the sidewalks they have around that building. Yeah.
Okay, you buy an LED light, they last a long, long time. So we bought a light that was 4 years ago and we buy another one today with the same amount of luminance and all that. Are they better shielded and better improved, or are they just basically the same bulb?
Two answers to that question. In general, there would be, just because of time, it wouldn't change whether it was better shielded or not. There were shielded lights available 4 years ago, and there are shielded lights available today. If you walk into Home Depot or walk into a hardware store and anywhere, or walk into Walmart or Menards, 99% of what you see is gonna be bad for outdoor lighting. It's gonna be bad. Outdoor unshielded lights, almost all those are gonna be 4,000 Kelvin. There'll be some 3,000 there. Some of the lamps at Menards now, I see the lamps, not the fixtures, are actually becoming available at 2,200 Kelvin or adjustable down to 2,200 Kelvin. So if you have an existing fixture, you could buy a warmer, a lower color temperature light. The second part to that is, though, that what I've noticed in the commercial market is that we've continued to improve the efficiency of LEDs. So 4 years, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there's a manufacturer that is used for a lot of farm lights. And their fixtures today are much more efficient than they were 4 years ago, to the point that I can buy a 2,200 Kelvin output light now that's more efficient than a 4,000 Kelvin was 4 years ago. So there's a chance to be more energy efficient and use a warmer color temperature of light than there was just 4 years ago. Any other questions?
Wisconsin moving to it. 2018 laws and that sort of thing. Why is Wisconsin being?
I think more than anything else, it's inertia, and it's a lack of understanding. I mean, like I said, I've spoken to 120 design professionals in the last few months, and really zeroed in this topic of color temperature more than anything else. And honestly, I was not as aware as I am right now 7 months ago about the problem of color temperature, because in the industry, it's been accepted that if you put in a 3,000 Kelvin LED and you buy a fully shielded fixture, we know as designers we can reduce the light levels in half. We knew that. We thought that was all we had to do. I thought that was all I had to do. It took me 2 years of talking to Alliant Energy to persuade them to put 3,000 Kelvin streetlights in Ontario rather than 4, because everywhere else in their entire system, hundreds of thousands of lights are put in, are all 4,000. I thought I was a winner. I thought I'd been a hero. And then I found out the sky got 50% brighter because of that. Now, it would have been a lot worse, of course, if we'd been 4,000, it would have been dramatically worse, but still, it got brighter because of all that effort, and it made it worse. But I think the problem is lack of understanding by people who are professionals, even like me, the fact that these standards are written based on old studies. And once those standards are in place, it takes a lot of effort to change those things. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's arguing against bringing our energy code more up to date, right? There's a 2024 version, there's a 2018, 2021 version. I don't know if anybody's actively arguing against it, but I don't see anybody actively arguing for it. And in fact, the fact that the version we have isn't even enforced, I mean, and why that doesn't happen, I think the answer to why that doesn't happen, which maybe is the bigger point, is the fact that it's the energy code, and there is nobody that goes out and inspects for the energy code in this state. We go out and inspect for structural and for other things. We don't inspect for energy code. Electrical inspectors don't inspect for it, and that'd be a logical place to do it, would be for the electrical inspector to do it, but we don't, right? And what's that? Cost, sure.
They contract with you, you're an electric engineer, do that type of work?
I don't know if the city of La Crosse has an internal electrical engineer or not. I don't know. Yeah. What's that? It varies a lot from city to city. Yeah.
Inspector, wouldn't that be part of the job?
A lot of cities don't have an electrical inspector. They contract out with somebody, right? Or somebody covers kind of all the disciplines, right? Yeah. But most of it is contracted out. I'd like it to be. I'd like it to be. Well, here's the reason why. I think here's the key thing. It's one of those things that falls in the cracks. So it's not in the electrical code. I have to follow the electrical code as an electrician, and as an engineer, I have to follow the electrical code. That requirement, that's not, that commercial thing I showed up there is not part of the electrical code. It's part of the energy code. So it's a subset of the building code, but it's a standalone document, right? So you have architects and general contractors who know they have to follow the building code. You have electricians and electrical engineers that have to follow the electrical code, but you have this energy code piece that's kind of lost in between those two. And so I think the same thing happens in municipalities, is they know they've got to go out and inspect the building. They know they have to inspect the plumbing and the electrical, but nobody thinks about inspecting the energy, and the energy crosses all those disciplines. And so it's just kind of one of those things that just falls through the cracks.
Oh, Christmas light.
Christmas lights, yeah, yeah. I'm anti-Christmas lights. No, I'm not. No, I'm not at all. No, I'm not. I'm kidding. You know, those are things that I don't even worry about. In fact, I had somebody ask me, I helped when Ontario had the flood in 2018. I went down and donated my time and labor to fix the big ballpark lights that light that softball field up at night. And I can see them from my house. I live up above the village. I can see them from my house. And somebody asked me, well, why do you do that? Doesn't that grate your nerves? And it doesn't, because they're on Thursday night for 3 hours, might be on again Saturday night for 3 hours. And yes, they throw light all over the place, right? But that part of the problem compared to all these other lights that are on all night long is a tiny piece of the problem. Christmas lights are the same way. That's fine. They're seasonal. Yeah. It's the things that are there all the time that are the problem. So, well, I have cards up here, and I do this as a volunteer entirely. So, you know, I work as an electrical engineer. That's how I still work part-time as an engineer. That's how I make money. But all the other stuff I do, this card for Redshift Electric, I afford that company. I have all those licenses just to do volunteer work. And so mainly consulting work. So if you have an interest in this, or you know an organization that has an interest in making improvements to their lighting, take a card and contact me. One downside of doing it as a volunteer is that, you know, you may not get a very quick response from me, because I got a lot of people that I'm helping right now. But I'm happy to do it, so yeah. Well, she said her husband works for GSA doing retrofits. GSA just in May adopted the Design Lights Consortium Luna standard for all their buildings, including retrofits. So that's the first organization in the country that I'm aware of that's adopted that as their standard. So you can tell them that for all that outdoor lighting, including any retrofit work, not just new work, all has to be DLC Luna qualified products, which is fantastic. That's a huge step. And they have like 100,000 buildings or something, and like it's amazing. So that's a huge thing. That's a really big thing. They exist. Yep, they're used in places. Yep, yeah, yep, yeah. And I think, you know, that's the thing, is that technology continues to improve. When motion sensors first came out, they were very unreliable, right? I didn't like motion sensors when they first came out. And so there's plenty of installations you can point to where the motion sensors don't work the way they're supposed to, but that technology has continued to improve. So now that they can, you know, now that they're required by the energy code in many states, the manufacturers had to improve what they did. Other people would just go crazy. So there are plenty of motion sensors now you can put on up to a 40-foot high pole and control where it senses and what level of sensing it does. And so they'll just become more and more reliable. The Norwalk, Ontario, Wilton School District, in their parking lot that they're retrofitting a lot of stuff there, all those parking lot lights have motion sensors on it, not by me wanting that. If I'd been more involved, they wouldn't be the color temperature they are. But at least they're motion sensor controlled, so they have the ability to be shut off most of the time. So, yeah. Yeah, thank you all.